The Chicago Bears have been cursed for nearly 5 decades now to not have a solid franchise quarterback to build around. While usually teams manage to get lucky at least one time in the last several decades, the Bears have been a consistent mess at the quarterback position. When Rex Grossman is your most successful quarterback of the current century, you know things aren't going too hot. Today I wanted to go over every Bears quarterback since their championship in the 80s. I'm mostly going to cover starting quarterbacks, with a few mentions of backups who played a role as well. Jim McMahon, famously known as the Punk QB, was drafted by the Chicago Bears as the 5th overall pick in the 1982 NFL Draft out of BYU. A charismatic and polarizing figure, McMahon quickly made headlines for his brash attitude, flashy style, and ability to deliver in high-pressure situations. During his tenure with the Bears, he became a key figure in their success, despite his tendency to clash with coaches and his offbeat approach to the game. He won the starting role his rookie season, but it really culminated a few years later. McMahon's best season came in 1985 when he was the catalyst for the Bears' legendary Super Bowl winning team. That year, McMahon led the team to a 12-1 record in his starts during the regular season, throwing for 2,400 yards and 15 touchdowns. His fiery competitiveness shone brightest in critical moments, including his memorable performance against the Minnesota Vikings on Monday Night Football, where he threw 3 touchdowns in rapid succession after coming off the bench. In Super Bowl 20, McMahon became the first quarterback in history to rush for 2 touchdowns in the game, as the Bears obliterated the New England Patriots 46-10. That season solidified his legacy as a leader and playmaker, even if his career was often derailed by injuries. Throughout his time with the Bears, McMahon was known for butting heads with authority figures, especially head coach Mike Ditka. The two often clashed over McMahon's approach to preparation and his outspoken nature. McMahon's disdain for rigid systems and his tendency to freelance on the field frustrated Ditka, while McMahon openly criticized the coaching staff in return. Despite their differences, the duo's dynamic fueled the team's success, with McMahon providing a confident counterbalance to Ditka's authoritarian style. Statistically, McMahon's career numbers reflect both his talent and his injury struggles. Over 15 seasons in the NFL, he threw for 18,000 yards, 100 touchdowns, and 90 interceptions, with a career passer rating of 78.2. His time in Chicago saw him throw for 11,000 yards, 67 touchdowns, and 56 interceptions over 7 seasons. I think he really is a more talented Jamarcus Russell with a similar work ethic. He never really put in the effort he needed to be one of the greatest of all time. McMahon was also infamous for his unapologetic attitude toward preparation, famously claiming, "I didn't study a lot and I didn't work that hard." This candid admission frustrated coaches but endeared him to fans who appreciated his raw talent and unfiltered personality. Many believe that with more dedication to his craft and fewer injuries, McMahon could have achieved even greater heights. Through the McMahon era, there were several quarterbacks that made their way through the Bears program. The biggest competition was Mike Tomczak, who actually briefly held the starting role in 1986 and 1988. He did manage to have a few solid seasons, with 1989 being his best year in Chicago with just over 2,000 yards passing. Tomczak did go on to be the Steelers' starting quarterback in 1996, where he had his best season, but overall was mostly important to give McMahon a challenger in the Bears system. Starting in 1987, they also brought in a new quarterback named Jim Harbaugh. Yes, that Jim Harbaugh. He was a first-round pick, mostly desired because both McMahon and Tomczak had injury and consistency issues. Harbaugh initially had huge struggles in the NFL. His first game saw him only going 1 for 15 against the Cardinals. In 1989, he started 5 games for the team and managed to throw for over 1,200 yards in his limited appearances. In 1990, he made a huge leap forward, leading the Bears through the first 14 games and throwing for over 2,100 yards and 10 touchdowns. Despite having a season-ending injury, the Bears finished 11-5 and won the division. At this point, Harbaugh had established himself as the starting quarterback going forward for the Bears, and he had his career best year in 1991. He threw for over 3,000 yards and was the first quarterback since Vince Evans to actually start every game in a season. Who had been quarterback in 1981? That might not sound like the best stat line, but I am going to give him credit because he was the most sacked quarterback in the league that year. He even got sacked 9 times in one game against the Minnesota Vikings. While they lost in the wild card, I think most Chicago fans had hoped the Harbaugh era could continue to blossom. However, in 1992, the Ditka era began to come to a close. They went only 5-11 that year. Harbaugh had only started 13 games despite playing in all 16, and ended up with just 2,500 passing yards, 13 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. At this point, the offense was starting to reach the cursed state it's still in today, and when in 1993 Harbaugh had yet another midseason, he decided to leave the Bears and move to Indianapolis, where he had an okay career. I don't think Harbaugh was ever the answer to the franchise quarterback prayers, but it seems like the Bears have a special way of just sapping the talent out of whoever they have at that position. From here, they went through a huge period of okay-ish to outright bad quarterbacks. They had Steve Walsh and Erik Kramer in 1994, and Kramer became the new de facto starting quarterback, barely hanging on to his job. He did have an incredible season in 1995 where he threw for 3,800 yards and 29 touchdowns, but after that battle injury, and only threw for 3,000 yards one more time in 1997. I do think if Kramer hadn't been injury prone, there is a huge chance he would have had a lot more statistical success. This is also when you have to start to question how the Bears handle quarterbacks. Jim McMahon had his career derailed by injury, so did Jim Harbaugh, and Erik Kramer was now the third quarterback to endure serious injuries. Yes, the game used to be more violent, but it seems like quarterbacks being injured is a consistent problem Chicago faces more than anyone else. They also cycled through Dave Krieg, Rick Meyer, Steve Stenstrom, and Moses Moreno through this period. None of them started for more than a few games while Erik Kramer was injured. The Bears seem like a blender for any quarterback, no matter how healthy you go in, you come out battling career debilitating injuries. In 1999, they attempted to take Cade McNown in the first round with the 12th overall pick, while Shane Matthews, yet another quarterback who had started that year as QB1, went down with an injury that pushed Cade McNown into the starting role. He had typical rookie struggles but threw for 1,400 yards and had 8 touchdowns in 6 games. With that being said, they named him the starter going into the 2000 season, and while he started strong, he completely fell apart and was benched partway through the season. He actually was so bad that after this, he actually never played in an NFL game again. He was out of the league by 2003, just 4 years after the Bears had spent a top 15 pick on the quarterback. I feel like this is when the woes of the franchise really start to be noticeable in the fan base. It had been almost 20 years since they had a true consistent franchise quarterback. Cade McNown was such a bust that the fan base realized there was no way they were going to be able to draft their way out of it. But that wouldn't stop the Bears front office from continuing to make an absolute mess out of this franchise's offense. They decided to start Jim Miller, who had an okay 2001 and a not so good 2002, where he was benched partway through for Chris Chandler. In 2003, they tried to sign what was left of Cordell Stewart and drafted Rex Grossman in the first round to sit behind him. Cordell only started 7 games before being benched for Chris Chandler again, who was then benched for Rex Grossman. In 2004, things got even crazier with Craig Krenzel, Chad Hutchinson, Jonathan Quinn, and Rex Grossman all starting at least 3 games for the franchise. You'd think at this point they would accept that Rex Grossman maybe wasn't the best use of a first-round pick, but instead they kept him on but also drafted Kyle Orton in 2005, and he ended up winning the starting job and started the first 14 games before he was then benched for Rex. At this point, the franchise had one of the best defenses of all time, and they had to make use of at least a semi-competent quarterback for their Super Bowl window. In 2006, Rex Grossman finally broke the full season starter curse and started every game. That year, the Bears went 13-3 with Rex Grossman throwing for over 3,000 yards with 23 touchdowns and 20 interceptions. He was so bad down the stretch that he had a passer rating below 50 for 5 regular season games. Either way, he managed to lead the team through the playoffs, and they would end up playing the Peyton Manning Colts in the 2006 Super Bowl. He did not perform well with 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions, and the Bears fell 29-17. If they would have had a solid quarterback this year, they probably would secure that Super Bowl much easier. After losing the Super Bowl, the Bears had Kyle Orton and Rex both still on the roster, but they signed Brian Griese to a 5-year contract for some reason, which was a total waste because he would only ever start 6 games for the franchise. They still spent that season with 3 different quarterbacks starting at least 3 games. They would trade Brian away to the Buccaneers for a 6th-round pick, and further confuse fans who wondered why they had signed a half-a-decade contract to only use the player for 6 games. However, that move became the Bears' trademark at quarterback. quarterback. In 2008, Kyle Orton won the starting job and started 15 games while Rex Grossman only started one. It was this offseason, however, where one of the funniest eras of Chicago quarterbacks' history takes place. Jay Cutler had been selected 11th overall in the 2006 season by the Denver Broncos. He was absolutely lighting the league on fire. While in Denver, his second season he threw for 3,500 yards with 20 touchdowns, and in 2008 threw for 4,500 yards with 25 touchdowns. Obviously, a quarterback who could throw for 45 yards in a season so early in his career was a very attractive piece for any team. So the Bears GM got to work, crafting a Madden-level trade. They would trade Kyle Orton, 2 first-round picks, and a 3rd-round pick to the Broncos in exchange for Cutler and a 5th-round pick. Keep in mind, Kyle Orton in 2008 had thrown for nearly 3,000 yards and would go on to throw for 3,800 yards in Denver the year after this trade went down. Cutler, after getting to Chicago, would sign a 2-year, $30 million contract extension, and in his very first game as a Bear, he threw 4 interceptions against Green Bay. The thing about Jay Cutler is that his performance is about as bipolar as you can get. His first year was proof of that. He did manage to throw for 3,600 yards and 27 touchdowns, but that came along with 26 interceptions, which led the league. They started to bring in talent like Mike Martz to build an offense around Cutler, and 2010 would be the only year the Bears would make the playoffs under Cutler's watch. He dropped to throwing for just 3,200 yards and 23 touchdowns, but dropped the interceptions to just 16. The Bears went all the way to the NFC Championship game, where Cutler would suffer a knee injury that took him out just after halftime. With Cutler out, the Bears were forced to play Todd Collins and wound up losing 21-14. This was really the peak of the entire Cutler era, and it would also be the peak of Bear fan delusion. In 2011, things were off to an interesting start. Mike Martz had dialed up the aggressiveness of the play calling despite Cutler coming off injury. Cutler had gotten the Bears off to a 6-3 start, but would break his thumb tackling a player who had made an interception on him. While he did finish out the game with a victory, it was found after that his injury was going to require surgery to heal. So the Bears cycled through Caleb Hain and Josh McCown, and both of them combined only won 1 game of their last 7. 2012 was off to a great start with Cutler having his best season so far, and the Bears starting 7-1. However, he suffered a concussion and they played Jason Campbell, yet another quarterback they had signed separately. While the Bears managed to finish 10th and 6th, they weren't able to get into the playoffs, and the second best year of the Cutler era was considered a dud. In 2013, he was having a great year again, but tore a groin muscle against the Washington Redskins. Josh McCown stepped back in and played relatively well, but Cutler took back his job and finished with a solid year considering missing several games. In January of that off-season, the Bears gifted Cutler a massive 7-year deal worth $126 million that would keep him there through 2020. He played okay personally in 2014 and 2015, but the Bears were a train wreck that finished 5th and 10th and 6th and 9th both seasons. At this point, tensions were developing between Cutler and the organization, and he had developed a McMahon-like attitude of not really caring or trying as hard as he could have been, coasting on his natural talent to put up okay stats and keep his job. The Bears had Jimmy Clausen as a potential young talent, and going into 2016, it was thought they may move on from Cutler. Cutler started 2016 well, but suffered a throwing shoulder injury in week 6 that took him out for the season. The Bears then started Matt Barkley and Brian Hoyer, who were different quarterbacks they also had on the roster for some reason. However, both of them were not necessarily future franchises pieces. After that season, the Bears bought out the remainder of Cutler's contract and he retired. But they then went ahead and signed Mike Glennon to a 3-year, $45 million contract and also drafted Mitch Trubisky with the 2nd overall pick of the draft. The plan was for Trubisky to sit behind Glennon and learn the game, but Glennon was not able to play at a high level and became a $45 million paperweight in week 5 when he was benched for Trubisky. Trubisky had a lot of the same problems every other Bears quarterback does: a bad offensive line and a rotating door of coaching staff. He had several okay seasons, throwing for over 3,000 yards twice and having 24 touchdowns in his peak season. However, he himself was not able to start every game in a season and had to share his role with Chase Daniels in 2018 and 2019. Going into 2020, the Bears had traded for Nick Foles from the Jaguars, and they had a quarterback battle splitting the starts that season, after which they moved on from Trubisky and drafted Justin Fields with the 11th overall pick of the draft. At this point, they were continuing the cycle of signing a quarterback for a ton of money, while also using a first-round pick on a new project. So instead of just using Foles as a stand-in while Fields was learning, they also went out and got Andy Dalton on a 1-year, $10 million contract to start. He started 2 games before he went out with knee injury, and Fields was named starter almost immediately. But that year was insane with 3 different starting quarterbacks. Justin Fields started 15 games the next year, and was playing pretty well until he was injured and had to be replaced by Nathan Peterman, who was yet another quarterback they had picked up. In 2023, Justin Fields would start 13 games before he was injured, and Tyson Bagent would come in and play in 4 games. Justin Fields was not able to be the magic cure to the Bears' disorganization, so instead of getting him more talent or a real offensive line to stand behind, they decided it would be better to trade him away and draft yet another shiny new toy in Caleb Williams with the first overall pick of the 2024 NFL Draft. Who would have thought that just changing quarterbacks wasn't going to solve the problem? So far, we've seen Caleb Williams running for his life behind a terrible O-line with coaches literally throwing games away they could have easily won. While it is still very early in Caleb Williams' career, this season he's managed to pass for only 3,300 yards with 19 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. That isn't a horrible season for a rookie, but what's crazy is that yardage is enough to get him 5th all-time for single-season passing yards in Bears history. It says a lot about your organization that no matter who they have at quarterback, they are not able to have the impact other teams can on offense. The best season in Bears history at quarterback came in 1995 when Erik Kramer passed for 3,800 yards and 29 touchdowns. That is a great season, but in the modern era, to be consistently dominant, you need more than that at your peak. This entire franchise has nothing but consistent injury issues at quarterback that have to be systemic to the franchise. I know some Bears fans talk about how their franchise is defense first, so quarterbacks will never throw for over 4,000 yards. But even franchises like the Steelers and Eagles have managed to do it with the same reputation. When Jay Cutler holds your franchise records with just over 20,000 passing yards, it says that something is wrong with the organization itself. The only thing that has stayed the same over these struggles is ownership in the same family. You would think billionaires would have figured out by now how to use their money to build a good football team, but the Bears ownership seems to have no idea how to right the ship they are in control of. As long as their ownership group continues to try to force a square peg in a circle hole, they aren't going to have any change as a franchise. It will be interesting to see how the Caleb Williams experiment pans out. From what rumors have been circulating this season, there is already fracturing in the locker room over who should be taking reps at quarterback. What sucks is that if they move on from Caleb Williams without fixing their offensive line issues, whoever is unfortunate to be drafted by them next will just be in the exact same position. No quarterback who is getting sacked as much as he is and having plays break down instantly will have success in the NFL. It's like their ownership group is playing Madden and just thinking if they draft enough quarterbacks in the first round, it will somehow magically fix their issue. They have one of the biggest markets and fan bases in the league. I do feel bad that such a huge fan base has just been disappointed over and over again. Putting more quarterbacks into this franchise is like putting your hand into a meat grinder. It's just going to be painful and traumatize you forever. From Jim McMahon to Jay Cutler, the fundamental issue has yet to be addressed and probably never will. So in summary, since Jim McMahon, the Bears have gone through Bob Avellini, Vince Evans, Steve Fuller, Rusty Lish, Greg Landry, Mike Tomczak, Doug Flutie, Steve Bradley, Mike Hohensee, Jim Harbaugh, Peter Tom Willis, Will Ferrer, Steve Walsh, Erik Kramer, Dave Krieg, Steve Stenstrom, Rick Mirer, Moses Marino, Cade McNown, Jim Miller, Shane Matthews, Chris Chandler, Henry Burris, Cordell Stewart, Rex Grossman, Craig Krenzel, Chad Hutchinson, Jonathan Quinn, Kyle Orton, Jay Cutler, Todd Collins, Caleb Hain, Josh McCown, Jason Campbell, Jimmy Clausen, Matt Barkley, Brian Hoyer, Mike Glennon, Chase Daniel, Nick Foles, Justin Fields, Andy Dalton, Trevor Siemian, Nathan Peterman, Tyson Bagent, and now Caleb Williams. That is the tale of the Chicago Bears quarterback carousel. They have been inconsistent for decades, and it is certainly looking like it's going to continue. At this point, it's probably better to just get a jersey with a Velcro nameplate so you can change out whatever name you want, which is usually 2 to 3 times a season. The fact it took almost a minute to name everyone who has started for them is pretty outrageous in my opinion. Until the ownership changes hands, I don't really see a way forward for the franchise to seriously improve. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to press the like button and subscribe. We post videos like this a few times a week and would love your support. Our last video was one about the 10 worst injuries in NFL history if you feel like watching that one, or just click the recommended video on screen. Thank you for watching. See you all soon.